Welcome to the City Club Friday Forum in the Renaissance Room. Those of you in the radio audience won't be able to appreciate the beauty of this room, but it's all decked out with marble walls and beautiful painted ceiling. I'm getting some echo, which I'm not quite sure how to speak because it's a long, narrow room. But in any case, welcome to all of you, and looking forward to an excellent presentation today that's entitled Proceeding On, Lewis and Clark's Continuing Journey Through the 21st Century. Our guest speakers today are Bobbie Conner, who's a member of the Umatilla, Cayuse, and Nez Perce tribes, and Vice President of the National Council for the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, and David SARASOHN, who's the Associate Editor of the Oregonian and author of historical writings, including the soon-to-be-published book, Waiting for Lewis and Clark. So welcome to all of you, and please be kind enough to turn off cell phones and other noise-making devices. And it's okay to clank your forks, though. Few announcements before we get started. Our next Friday Forum, April 15th, will be held over in our usual space across the hall. And it should be a very interesting program because it's featuring the new presidents and their new priorities, entitled Taking Private Education to a Higher Degree. The speakers will be Reverend E. William Beecham, who's president of the University of Portland, Colin Diver, who's president of Reed College, and Thomas J. Hochstetler, who's president of Lewis and Clark. I'd also like to mention that we are still in about the midpoint of our annual membership drive, and we are happy to say that we have acquired many new members. And I see Tom Lauderdale sitting back there. He's been out of the country, but Tom was kind enough to offer an Oregon memorabilia package, and that was given to the first lucky winner. Thanks very much, Tom. He's been collecting awards in Paris and other European countries. For those of you who don't know, he has the leader of the band Pink Martini. I'd also like to mention that our new leaders mixer and meeting is coming up on Monday, April 18th from 5:30 to 7 at the City Club Commons. It's a reception and a planning meeting, so those of you who haven't had a chance to attend new leaders functions before should be a fun way to get to know people, because the Voila Cafe will be open as well. Then we also have our City Club Theater presentation, which will be Sunday, April 24th, a 2 p.m. matinee at the Miracle Theater, and the production is Fuente Ovejuna. It will be followed by a post-play discussion with the director and the cast and the translator, but it is not subtitled. It is in actual English, but it was obviously translated from the Spanish. Tickets can be purchased from City Club office, so that's 2 p.m. on Sunday, April 24th. Then on April 21st, we continue our post-Illahee lecture discussion, and April 25th, our Citizens Read Book Club will be held. This month's book selection is Collapse by Jared Diamond. And don't forget our final Friday open house, which is held on the final Friday of each month. And this will be on April ? Because I don't know what the final, I think maybe it's the 28th, 29th maybe. In any case, all of the details for membership and for these upcoming events can be located in the membership or in the bulletins. And it's also online at pdxcityclub.org, where you can feel free to express your opinions on our citizens blog. So please feel free to go online and just see what's happening. We have some interesting new things on our website. Now I'd like to move on to, I'd be very remiss if I forgot to mention that our sponsors this quarter are Pope and Talbot, Providence Health Systems, and Zimmer Gunsel Frasca, without whose underwriting these programs would not be possible. So thank you very much to them. Thank you. Now to move on today to our program, I'd like to first introduce Roberta, aka Bobbie Conner. She's the director of I had practiced this, tamastslikt Cultural Institute, tamastslikt Cultural Institute, and has been the director since 1998. It's part of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, which Bobbie tells me is pronounced umatilla by some people from the south and from east of here. It's part of the Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And Bobbie is Cayuse, Umatilla, and Nez Perce, and a member of the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla. She's vice president of the National Council of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Board of Directors and a member of the Circle of Tribal Elders. She also serves on the boards of directors for the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial in Oregon, the Oregon Cultural Trust, and the Wallowa Nez Perce Homeland Project, and is a member of the Oregon Parks and Recreation Commission. She's a graduate of Pendleton High School, University of Oregon, and Willamette University's Atkinson School of Management. Our other guest is David SARASOHN, who joined the Oregonian in 1983 as forum editor, and in 1985 was named associate editor. The next year began writing editorials and columns. He's an editorial writer and editorial page columnist for the newspaper, and a national columnist for the Newhouse News Service. He's widely recognized as a writer, and his columns won the first place awards in the Best of the West. The American Civil Liberties the American Civil Liberties Union of Oregon awarded him its Freedom of Expression Award in 1995, the first time it was given to a journalist. And the Society of Professional Journalists awarded him the Pulliam Fellowship for editorial writers for a project on the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial and the future of the West. SARASOHN received a BA and MA in history from Trinity College in Connecticut and a PhD in history from UCLA. And he's quite a star. He's appeared on the Today Show and the McNeil-Lehrer news shows. So welcome, please, both of our guests.
Niach Pashwai, Shiach Pashwai, Tatzalach, good day. When visitors come to Tamastslikt Cultural Institute to learn about Lewis and Clark, they tend to think of the Lewis and Clark expedition according to the lines of popular history. And that is an innocent journey of exploration that created a remarkable, unprecedented record for Western science, created documentation that would be used later, much later, in Indian land claims cases, and created maps. If you take a longer view of the history of the Pacific Northwest, it's not the history of the beginning of the United States. I'm going to invite you to take a little walk with me today, looking through a longer lens, over a longer period of time, about the history of this place we all call home together now. It's a little bit like a bad date when we go to talk about Lewis and Clark sometimes. When you have a date and someone incessantly speaks about themselves and at one point takes a breath and then says, "Enough about me, what do you think about me?" People come to us and they want to know what our people said about Lewis and Clark's 1 week in 1805 on the way out and 1 week in 1806 on the way back. That's a fairly narrow construct for us to describe our history, because our people have lived in this landscape for a very, very, very long time. As a consequence, when we go to talk about Lewis and Clark, we talk about it in context, but we also talk about it as a personal history, the story of our ancestors who met the expedition. It is not a remote story. It is not distant from our personal lives. It is very much the history of our families. It is the history of our villages. It is the history of the sacred foods given to us by the Creator. When we talk about Lewis and Clark's expedition, for us, looking at it in context, it is indeed the advent of much that would be adversarial for our people for the next 200 years. If you look at the arrival of Lewis and Clark in 1805 as the arrival of the first white men in the Columbia River Plateau, you begin to understand that our history, thousands and thousands of years old, looks at these 33 travelers as a curiosity, as an economic opportunity for trade, but 33 men and women and one baby and one dog do not represent a threat to the control of our homeland. And indeed, what they represent as they take the fantasy of Jefferson, President Thomas Jefferson, across the United States to seek the fabled Northwest Passage, they are bringing with them the western expansion of the United States. But they're well outside the boundary of the Louisiana Purchase when they come here. They're well outside the boundary of the 17 great nations. They're in our country. No one but us lives here. Only the tribes control trade here. Only the tribes create modes of transportation or raid neighboring tribes for modes of transportation. It is that context in which Lewis and Clark arrived. When they came into our country, there was already a prophecy that we would have a time of great change, that these new people would come, that they would be strange. And indeed they were. The prophecy tells us that in order for our people to flourish again, we will have to survive very difficult times. And if we do, we'll be strong again. When Lewis and Clark arrive in our homeland, they are unaware how advanced our food preservation methods are. They are unaware of our reciprocity agreements for safe passage through enemy country. They are unaware of the trade alliances and marriage alliances we have along the Columbia River, south, north, and east of us. And they're unaware of anadromous fish. They did not know why hundreds of salmon were lying dead in the river, floating, some on the bottom, creamers. It's not important that they didn't know that. What's important is what we now know about salmon. It's not important that Lewis and Clark didn't understand the cultures. What's important is that we make them flourish. How many of you realize that we lose one indigenous language in the world every week? If you lose the language of the people who have known the landscape for a very long time, you have just lost empirical data. If you look at our thousands of years on the landscape as a different form of empiricism, what you begin to understand is that the knowledge about the ecosystem contained in the indigenous languages of our people tells the story of how the landscape works. When we lose that information, we lose connections to knowledge about how to take care of where we live. Lewis and Clark, when they came, created a very good record. That record informs us today about the ecosystem. Which brings me to the bicentennial. The bicentennial is a tremendous opportunity. 100 years ago in Portland at the exposition, commemorating the centennial of the expedition, Filipino people were regarded as savage people for eating dogs. Lewis and Clark bought a good proportion of the dogs they consumed on the expedition from our people. Probably 25 to 30% of the dogs they consumed in the Pacific Northwest were purchased from the Walla Walla and Umatilla and other Columbia River Plateau tribes. They don't typically get referred to as savages. Things have changed, and yet savage mascots prevail. The bicentennial is an opportunity for us to do much. How much we will achieve really depends on the citizenry of the United States. American Indians created enough noise to quash the Columbus Day quincentennial. That's not happening this time. Why not? Because 41 tribes are represented on the Circle of Tribal Advisors advising the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial's National Council. Because tribes are on the board of directors of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial in Oregon, and on Washington State's Advisory Commission for the Bicentennial. This is an interesting approach, and it's not just political correctness. The reason it's interesting is because for most of our history, decisions have been made about American Indian tribes without American Indian tribes at the table. When Lewis and Clark came here, when Thomas Jefferson dispatched them, we were nations, and we are still nations. Interestingly enough, when Lewis and Clark came here, there was no intermediary advisory council. There was no one to arbitrate the discussions over budget. They did the best they could, all of them, both sides, with very difficult communication. At this point in time, we have the same opportunity to do what they did, to face each other and have a national dialogue we have postponed for over 100 years. If history truly informs us, and the languages that of our ancestors tell us about how this place should be, then perhaps that dialogue would benefit the landscape that we intend for our great-grandchildren to inherit. If tribes look at the bicentennial as an opportunity, it's an opportunity to do this, to honor. Much has been made about the semantic of celebrate versus commemorate. When someone passes away, we do celebrate their life. In this case, we celebrate the tribe's survival against all odds. In this case, commemorate works for me and for the National Council, who recognize that we want to honor all the ancestors who made this history. All of the ancestors who provided safe passage to Lewis and Clark's expedition. All of the ancestors who provided information and sustenance to the expedition. All of the ancestors who were smart, who did not want to accept peace medals. Those who were smart, who did accept peace medals. In honoring the ancestors of both sides of the story, we make the story more complete. It is sometimes difficult to do. The Circle of Tribal Advisors supports the right of other tribes to protest, nonviolently, all kinds of things related to the expedition. This opportunity that we have to create this national dialogue about what one nation can do to other nations is something we must take seriously. Why? Because it's our history. It's not just my history, it's not just your history, and it's certainly not just the members of the expedition's history. When the Western Expansionist Reconnaissance Team came to the Pacific Northwest, Lewis and Clark were courageous. They were diligent. They performed their job well. People sometimes bristle. The hair on the back of my neck stands up when I hear about us being discovered. It's not so much that discovery, the idea of it, takes anything away from us. It doesn't. To be discovered presumes that something existed before. But the word discoverer was used 300 years before Lewis and Clark came to the Pacific Northwest in the context of discoverers' rights. What the United States bought from the Louisiana Purchase, or when they bought the Louisiana Purchase, was they bought from Napoleon and France were the discoverers' rights. Lewis and Clark's expedition was used to stake the claim on the Pacific Northwest in competition with Britain for America. Lewis and Clark's branding, carving, map making were all rituals of the rights of discovery being exercised. As a consequence, we cannot look at the expedition without saying to ourselves, this nation should accept the responsibility for what came after Lewis and Clark. To do otherwise is to fail to recognize the importance of their journey. Commemorating, honoring what they did requires looking at the whole picture, not just part of it. Not just the romantic, environmentalist, buckskin-clad people with an Indian woman out front pointing. By the way, we don't point that way, we point this way. For those of you in the radio audience, I wasn't using my fingers. I was using my lips. It is important for us as we look at Lewis and Clark's expedition to look also at what they noted, not just about the people, not just the ethnography and the languages, but at the species, and to look at the landscape that we have today. One of the things that happens when you look at things from a tribal perspective is that you look at things in the long view. In the long view, we have to know that when we ruin the lives of our relatives, we create peril for people who come after us. When we look at the long view, you tend not to be a transient. People in Oregon understand this. People in Oregon always tell you how long they've lived here, or whether they were born here, or which generation they came from, how many generations of Oregonians. We value our longevity on this same landscape because we value the place we're from. Looking at that for thousands of years and valuing that landscape for thousands of years teaches us not to behave like irresponsible transients who pollute and litter our home. Animals are smarter than us in many ways. They know better than that most of the time. When we talk about the mutual history of the Lewis and Clark expedition, we talk about the mutual history of a landscape, the mutual history that's only 200 years young as Americans. But as people who love this landscape, people who have loved other landscapes, your ancestors, it's not hard to imagine what consequence irresponsibility brings us. And that's why tribes look at the bicentennial as an opportunity to create change, awareness, education, and hopefully a little bit of economic benefit as well. One of the very, very important messages that the National Council of Lewis and Clark Bicentennial carries is that the tribes are still here. In fact, we're not leaving. And on that note, I have to mention that Lewis and Clark observed and noted extensively, and actually reprimanded one of the members of the expedition for gambling with us. One man, there was an incident in the journals, if you're familiar with the journals, where Lewis and Clark wanted to trade canoes for horses on the return journey. And they wanted to do straight-away business. They didn't want a dicker. How many of you have ever wanted to go in a street market and not have to bother with that? Well, Lewis and Clark were impatient, but one of the members of the expedition wasn't, and he gambled. And he lost a horse, but he got a bundle of other goods. The captains took the goods. He may have been punished. It's not noted in the journals. But they, the captains, ordered a canoe chopped up rather than leave it for the thieving Indians, they said. They could have gambled. They might have gotten horses. It's an important part of our history, and it was not something we were castigated for until missionaries arrived. It was the way we redistributed wealth. It's an issue that's of contemporary significance today, just like salmon restoration, clean water, clean air, and taking care of the other species that live here in this homeland with us. One of the things that 2005 brings to the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla is the anniversary of our treaty, the 150th anniversary. Most people are not familiar with the transcript of those treaty proceedings. I suppose a few people in this room are. In those proceedings, Lewis and Clark are mentioned many times. At the Tribal Treaty Council, Governor Stevens and Superintendent Palmer remind us that our ancestors were good to Lewis and Clark, that Lewis and Clark did not make trouble, that the Great White Father wants to take care of us because we've been kind to his people. In the Treaty Council, Lewis and Clark are invoked numerous times because they were exercising the rights of discovery. In that Treaty Council, where our tribes ceded 6 million acres of our homeland, promises were made. The bicentennial presents an opportunity for us to remind people about those promises. People think about treaties as Indian rights, Indeed, treaties are how everyone else got legal title to our land. Everyone should care about upholding those promises. It would behoove Americans to understand what treaty making is about, because we make treaties today with other nations as well. When my grandfather tried to explain to my mother why he served in World War I in the Navy in France before he had the right to vote, he told her, "Our devotion to this place is more important than any piece of paper. It is the place that our people come from. It is not a place that we can give away. It is not a place that we will ever leave." As a consequence, we look at the bicentennial as an opportunity to share that message. We're not going anywhere. We're staying. We want to work with you. And the reason we want to work with you is because we love this place we're from. Yoko Kalo.
Thank you. I always figured I could follow Lewis and Clark. I wasn't at all sure I could follow Bobbie. I want to thank KORLEEN for mentioning my upcoming book. I'm going to be mentioning it myself 6 or 7 times. You know, when you come in to the Oregon State Capitol down in Salem, you're greeted by Lewis and Clark. There's a huge mural when you come in off the wall. Lewis and Clark in one of those one-week trips in the Columbia, being greeted by Bobbie's people. And they're greeting them, and they're greeting anyone who has to do with the state. And in fact, their responsibilities are pretty broad. They also greet anyone who's coming into the Montana State Capitol, anyone who's coming into the Missouri State Capitol. These are people who are still a guiding and directing force after 200 years, which is more than you can say for Aaron Burr. And I was looking at this picture about a month and a half ago, when the state legislature, the state government, was having its opening session of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. And it was in the House chamber, and in the House chamber there's carved on the wall Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, Sacagawea. And we have all of the leadership of the state noting this occasion. And it seemed to me an indication of how closely the bicentennial is connected to us now and connected to decisions we're making now. And what began this was a chanting and a procession from the United Tribes of the Grand Ronde. It's a group of tribes who have been forcibly transferred from various places across the West, including the Lewis and Clark Trail, onto a patch near the Oregon coast, which now has Spirit Mountain Casino, which is now the single largest tourist attraction in the state of Oregon, having just shot by Multnomah Falls. And what they said was the tribal elder who gave the invocation and the governor in his remarks were all about the interest in the bicentennial, all about the possibility of environmental advance, all about the possibility of tourism, and about connecting. And Ted Kulingoski came out and said, We're ready to preserve our natural heritage. The Oregon Lewis and Clark saw will be protected for future generations. We're ready for tourism. Oregon is ready for its close-up. Now, I've been following this story now for about 2.5 years. Now, ever since the first thing I did was walk into a CODA meeting in Pendleton, being chaired by Bobbie, who then embarrassed me by stopping the meeting and warning everybody that there was a journalist there. And I have heard this message, the message that came from Kulangoski, all across the country. Up the Columbia, over the mountains, the length of the Missouri, Louisville, Monticello, Washington, D.C. There is this sense of opportunity, this sense of anticipation. And the bicentennial is coming not only at a 200th anniversary of Lewis and Clark. It's coming at a crucial moment for the West, a time when the entire region is changing, and people who are seeing this as a whole range of opportunities. And at this point, all across the West, people are waiting for Lewis and Clark. That's the first book plug. Now, this whole bicentennial has always had a different feel from the National Bicentennial of 1976, which, if you remember, sort of a self-congratulatory event. The tall ships and the quarter, and the idea that we were a direct line from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. No, the bicentennial wasn't about what Americans were doing. It was a congratulation of who we already were. The Lewis and Clark bicentennial, like the original expedition, is more about what's going to happen next. And the importance of this comes from the confluence of two rich streams, the power of the story and the power of the moment. Now, nobody would say that up to this point we've forgotten Lewis and Clark. They have given their name to counties, colleges, cities, parks, wildlife areas, saloons, elementary schools from Charlottesville to St. Helens, middle schools, including one in Tulsa that I've never been able to figure out, interpretive centers, community centers, real estate agencies, including one in Massachusetts, car dealerships, a World's Fair, a pest control company, bed and breakfasts, churches, boat rides, rivers, bridges, bird species, restaurants. We had 2 new ones in Portland just last year. One of them was the Oregonian's Restaurant of the Year. We're getting off. And wilderness areas. But it's been a particular kind of celebrity. They've never been what you'd call the top-level Western heroes. They've never been Wild Bill Hickok. They've never had their own TV show. But over the past couple of decades, it's become something more significant. Now, part of this is Stephen Ambrose in Undaunted Courage, which retells the whole story as this mythic and Jeffersonian occasion of heroism and judgment, and a national saga of connection. And the book galvanized readers' interests. You can go along the trail and you will find all these people who say they got into this from reading the book. And moreover, at virtually every place along the trail, you can buy the book in about 32 different editions. There's a similar effect from Ken Burns' documentary on Lewis and Clark, which appeared in the 90s and which still appears regularly on Pledge Week. And it too talks about this. It talks about the connection, the core and the land, about what remains, about what's gone. And that drove people out too. You know, as anybody who's sold Homes of the Stars maps in Beverly Hills knows, people go out to see what they saw on television. But now, as the West is entering a 21st century, the timeliness is part of the nature of the expedition and the things that give it meaning. Because as this century turns, Americans are more open to a particular kind of explorer. The kinds of explorers who wrote hundreds of thousands of words on the natural world they discovered, and who, when they encountered the Indians, as the Advertising Council radio spot says, it's a military expedition notable for the battles they didn't fight. You find the bicentennial that you find useful. And all through the West, people saw the opportunity of this one. Bobbie's told us about the origins, the development of the council, the circle of tribal advisors. There's other dramatic people involved in this. There is Gerard Baker, the Mandan Hidatsa superintendent in the Park Service, who became head of the Lewis and Clark Trail. He used to say that he thought it was a good thing that the Lewis and Clark observation was in charge of an American Indian. Didn't happen that way the first time around. And there's an opportunity here for Indians, as Bobbie says, to give their own story, which is also something that hasn't generally happened. We're at Monticello for the opening of this. Gerard's brother, Frederick, was telling a joke about the way tribes perceive their image. He said there's a tribal story that an Indian nuclear family consists of the parents, the grandparents, the kids, and an anthropologist. This is an opportunity to tell a story themselves. And there's other people who saw they had an opportunity here. From the very beginning, environmentalists, including Ambrose himself, saw an opportunity to reconnect here. American Rivers has a major effort reclaiming the rivers of Lewis and Clark. And they've got this huge traveling exhibit, fills up a basketball field, based on the idea recreating a Missouri River Lewis and Clark would recognize. That is perhaps not entirely likely. But you could get to something which has more connection to what they saw. The Sierra Club also has the largest event in its history, protecting the lands of Lewis and Clark. 33 sites across the country, including one that Senator Wyden has now introduced into Congress, the Lewis and Clark Mount Hood Wilderness Area, expanding some territory out there, protecting some more of that. And there's a sense of possibility here. There's a calculation that this is a way to talk to different people. This is a way to open a conversation with people you might normally consider tree huggers. And there's a whole other West. There's a West which stretches the length from the east side of Portland. You can carry on this trail and you don't run into another city until you get near Omaha. And this is a rural West which for centuries has been essentially a resources-driven economy, a ranching, mining, logging economy. And all of those economies are in decline. Some of the most spectacular parts of the trail are places that are at this point almost depopulating. North Dakota is the only state that has fewer people living there now than in 1930. It's also the only state that right now has fewer people than were there in the 2000 census. Now, Montana, which is a spectacular area, is also perhaps the lowest wage state in the country. And there's two other journalists, Jack Kaufman and George Anthon, who went out on the plains and said, it's ironic that as the nation celebrates the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition, much of the region they opened to European American settlement is being abandoned. Now, with the end of this, with the change in this economy, places all over the trail see an opportunity here. They see an opportunity in heritage tourism. This is the fastest part of the travel business, and the bicentennial seems a chance to catch on to it. Now, it's a changing Western economy, and governors and chambers of commerce and bed and breakfast operators think they've got a connection here. And Oregon is not the only place that's ready for its close-up. Now, like so many of the rivers of the West, these three streams of strategy often run into each other. There's a connection and a similarity between some of the tribal priorities and some of the environmental priorities. There's a connection between environmental issues and local tourism possibilities. You know, people don't want to go places where there isn't something worth looking at. There's an advance on many levels here in the possibility of tribal tourism. As you came in today, you saw they were handing out a blue pamphlet about tribal tourism, about tips on how to go and also how to behave when you go into tribal areas along the trail. What's truly striking, what's significant about the Lewis and Clark bicentennial is that there's a whole new core of explorers. People who are trying to reach not the Pacific, but the future. And in something that's beyond anything Lewis and Clark ever wanted to do, they have a belief that they can actually change the place they're going before they get to it. You know, I always said, when people asked what I was doing here and if I was going to be climbing mountains and fording rivers and walking across Montana, that actually I wasn't really interested in Lewis and Clark. I'm interested in the people who are interested in Lewis and Clark. And all of these people bringing their own agendas and their own hopes to the bicentennial share something with that first core, and with all of the 200 years of the West in between, which is this powerful sense of expectation, of hope, and of possibility. And that's what I mean for the absolute last book plug when I say people are waiting for Lewis and Clark. Thank you.
That's one of the things I love about City Club, is that you get some very interesting speakers who, such as these two, who provide very different perspectives than perhaps we've had in the past. We're now ready for our question and answer period. The microphone is over here to my left, and I guess you can sort of crowd against the wall so that other people can see. Sorry, radio audience, it's a narrow room. I would like to ask that each of you who comes to ask a question contain your question to 30 seconds or less. Thank you. And our first question today will come from our board host, who is Chris Smith. He's a member of the Board of Governors and has been a member since 1991 of the City Club. He is the head of the, he chairs the Advocacy and Awareness Committee, and He is lead internet technologist for the Xerox Office Group. Chris?
Thank you, Korleen. My question is going to be based on Bobbie's remarks, but I'd welcome David's thoughts as well. I was struck by you're talking about the long view, in part because that's very much what the selection for City Club's book club this month, Collapse, is about, is all about societies that fail to take the long view and the very drastic consequences. And also struck by your comment that we lose an indigenous language every week. And that reminds me a lot of another organization I belong to, Slow Food, where we're concerned about food varieties that we're losing. So for example, we work to make sure that we have breeds of turkeys other than the ones that have the most overdeveloped body parts to make butterballs, and preserving varieties of potatoes other than the one that makes the best McDonald's French fry. And it seems to me that as you said, there's incredible knowledge about how to work with the landscape we live in those languages. So my question to you is, we know what to do to preserve potatoes. What do we do to preserve those languages and the knowledge of those cultures?
Thank you for asking. Many tribes, of the 500 plus languages that were alive on the continent at the point of contact, about 175 languages exist in North America today of indigenous peoples. And many are in extreme peril of disappearing in the next 10 years or less. The challenge before us is not just one of funding projects and programs and paying people to focus on this issue. It's also one of advocacy for the multiplicity of cultures being beautiful. And much has been made of racial and ethnic and cultural diversity over the past 2 decades. But indeed, in appreciating one another's differences, the effort to keep languages alive requires more than appreciation for differences. The appreciation has to be manifest in very, very physical ways. And let me give you an example of perhaps the best I know. A linguist from the University of Oregon, an anthropologist, moved to our reservation to finish his work with us because he knows how important this work is. A man who started working with my grandparents in the 1960s, who is a retired professor at the University of Queensland in Australia, comes back every year to work with us on the preservation of these languages. It's a physical, long-term commitment to not only document the languages in case we do lose them, but the physical commitment of 3 young people in our tribe now, one who's becoming joint doctoral, who is a joint doctoral student about to complete his dissertation in linguistics. We have a student, a tribal member, who has turned her career and life over to studying one of our tribal languages, umatilla. Another who has, as an undergraduate student, turned his time away from college back to teaching in the tribal school. Individual people make individual commitments to keep languages alive. And with a tribe whose population is under 2,500 people, who have 3 languages as indigenous languages left of the 4 we used to speak, that commitment is tremendous. It's an enormous commitment. It's a vow. Because we have in Umatilla a handful of people who are adults. In Walulapum or Walla Walla, we have less than a handful of elders for whom that language is their first language. So when I suggest to you that it's more than appreciation and awareness, it is the personal, physical commitment that people make to help keep languages alive. And there are a lot of people who can help with technology, with funding, with their own personal endeavors. But on the most fundamental level, it's the individuals who are willing to become students of that language and devote their lives to keeping it alive. And I would suggest to you that even though anthropologists may suggest that we can't, after puberty, become linguistically fluent in a variety of languages, it's still worth trying. It is important because I think for us to see the possibility and grasp the possibilities that David was talking about, we have to continue to be students. And We have many students who are adults now studying our languages. The fact of the matter is that we may not achieve fluency, but we will keep as much as we can keep alive. And I think the most successful example of keeping a language alive is probably Hebrew. And we are much smaller in population, so we're really working against the odds.
I'm Susan Pierce, member. This is mostly for Bobbie, although David chime in. And it follows up a little on Chris's question. I came to Portland a few years back as a college student from a town on the Clearwater on the edge of the Nez Perce Reservation. Thank you for that history lesson. We owe you much in the way of thanks and apology. My question is, where do we go from here? What is your vision of where we go from here?
I'm not sure where. I guess my answer is always home. From my perspective, this story has always been about land. Always will be about land and water. We still have water fights in the West. The warriors wear different suits than they used to. Cowboys, cattle rustlers, Indians. Everybody goes to court looking a little different than we do every day. But it's still a story about the land. It will always be a story about the land. And it really is a story about us as stewards of taking care of each other and doing the earth no harm. That's fundamentally what our ancestors said at our Treaty Council in 1855. If we can do that, which seems small, but is not. If we can do that, if we can take good care of one another and do the earth no harm, there's no telling what tomorrow holds. I guess that's my vision. Take care of each other and do each other no harm. Do the earth no harm.
There's a question here about reconnection, which is largely a matter of reconnection to earth and water, which has a number of levels about the legal aspects of regulation and preservation. It has to do with questions about simply having access to these areas, many which are now difficult to get to. As in St. Louis, when I went there, people were saying that the reason the city is there is because of the rivers, but it's actually not that easy at this point to get to the rivers. And they've got an effort there, Metropolitan Waters Corridor, to try to connect that. And I think this possibility is not just about physical ties. I think it's about different parts of the country connecting with each other. And I think one of the advantages of heritage tourism is that somebody from New England who comes out to look at Montana afterwards becomes, in some ways, a different New Englander. And I think this whole effort of the bicentennial and the legacies that come out of it are about people reconnecting to the land and to each other.
My name is Frank Baumann, and my question is aimed to both speakers, but primarily the first speaker. The first speaker was kind enough to remind us of the treaty, I assume, between the Umatillas and Washington, and I would be grateful if she and the second speaker could comment briefly on to what extent that treaty, in terms of rights and duties between the parties, still is operative today and prospectively for tomorrow.
As long as I stay out of litigative areas, I'm probably okay. The Treaty of 1855 between the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla tribes with the United States has in its articles the cession of land, the reservation of land for our peoples to live on, and reserved rights, as well as a variety of other clauses having to do with payment. When you evaluate the treaties and you look at the articles of the treaty, what you see is that most of the people who were involved on the US side of the transaction were offering payments that were short-term, 20 years of a sawmill, 20 years of blacksmith services, 2 teachers for a certain period of time, probably not to exceed 2 decades. There were sums and annuities, a house for this chief and a house for this chief. None of them very long-term in retrospect. But in retrospect, when you look at what our ancestors negotiated in terms of the reserved rights, which are still very much at the heart of the treaty for us, they were looking at forever. So the reserved rights terms for the reserved right of our people to hunt, fish, trap, graze livestock in common, and gather our traditional foods, roots and berries, are forever. And those reserved rights have been the subject of lawsuits, continue to be subject matter for a variety of kinds of press coverage, and those reserved rights have with them some very important contemporary issues. For example, one issue with hunting and digging, for example, as well as picking berries, has to do with access to public lands. Once you can get there, if you can harvest, if the plants remain and the game remains, there's another issue, and that is contamination. So the rights that we fight to protect are sometimes already compromised because what we're fighting to eat is already contaminated food. We happen to be, in our homeland, subject to the consequences of the Hanford nuclear project, as well as the Umatilla Army Depot, and now the chemical incineration project. And we fight as I think many of you know, very, very hard to restore salmon to the Umatilla River after an absence of 70 years. And we are grateful for the tremendous cooperation we had from irrigators and the state and others who were partners on that project, and now the tribe's involved in a similar project in the Walla Walla Basin. But it's sad when we talk about our consumptive habits, we tend to eat more salmon. The analysis for what's risk in contaminants in consumption of salmon or fish is based on a diet that's not tribal. So our consumptive habits of salmon put us at greater risk of consuming more contaminants than most citizens who are our neighbors. So the treaty rights that we fight for are often compromised before we've concluded the fight for the species or the right, because plants have been killed off in not only roots but berries. We also face an enormous challenge with economic opportunity, and that is, for example, in the harvest of huckleberries. There are people who do not take care of the plant. They over-harvest. We've actually had elders who've gone to the mountains and who have seen people who cut bushes and sat in the shade and picked the berries off. There are people who have raking machines. So I don't think, even though our ancestors had incredible foresight to imagine what we needed to survive in retaining those reserved rights for us, I don't think they ever imagined that we would not have Celilo Falls, that we would not, it would not be safe to eat those foods. And so the treaty rights that we fight for today are a little tainted by the fact that we've done some things to the environment that we have to undo. So does that answer your question?
It's been very helpful, and I thank you very much.
David?
Well, on this, Bobbie knows a great deal more about it than I do, but there's another question here which has to do with sort of broader implications. It's where I was talking about where the tribal and environmental issues run together. So if there is a tribal guarantee of salmon fishing rights, presumably this carries an implied guarantee that there's going to be a salmon fishery. And therefore, all of the questions about the Columbia, about the snake, become not only species issues and not only economic issues, but also directly tribal and treaty issues. And a number of the tribes involved here, such as the Nez Perce, have become major players on this line. Something like the 4 dams on the snake issue, which have been examined in all possible directions from the biological and the physical and the river's perspective, is also an issue about the rights of the Nez Perce and about what's actually going to get up to their homeland. So that whole question is alive with us today.
Well, thank you to our speakers for some very enlightening words today. I think we'll be headed out there in the wilderness, David, just to see what's out there for ourselves and have a lot more respect for your perspective of how Lewis and Clark come to your land rather than the opposite, which is typically how we grew up thinking about it in American history. I hope that you'll all be able to join us next week for the new college presidents, and we are adjourned. Thank you.